In addition to alcohol, prostitution also drew the critique of progressives, who linked it to the spread of diseases and viewed it as a threat to female virtue. In 1907, McClure's magazine printed a muckraking article that argued that many prostitutes were victims of white slavery and that they had been forced into selling sexual favors. Reformers did not show the same concern for Black or Asian prostitutes. Some reformers took a moralistic approach to the problem, and in 1910, Congressional Representative James Mann gained passage of the White Slave Trade Act, which prevented women from being bought and brought across state lines for immoral purposes. Others argued that prostitution was a public health issue, and the American Social Hygiene Association pushed for legislation to curtail prostitution, particularly near military bases where the health of soldiers could be compromised. Moral reformers also fought the spread of drugs, which was a problem on a much smaller scale than alcohol. Roughly 250,000 people habitually used opium, morphine, or cocaine. Medicines like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was a treatment for colic in babies, contained opium, while the ingredients of Coca-Cola included cocaine until 1903. Anti-narcotic campaigns had racial undertones as well, with efforts to stop the use of opium reflecting broader anti-Asian sentiment. In 1914, the American Medical Association joined forces with the reformers to push for the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Control Act, which banned non-medicinal uses of narcotics. Reformers also sought to fix the juvenile justice system, emphasizing the rehabilitation and an appropriate path to curtailing juvenile delinquency. Youthful offenders were removed from dysfunctional homes and made to be wards of the state. Young women's moral choices were frequently called into question. Women's health gained prominence among reformers such as Margaret Sanger, who led the fight for birth control. Sanger believed that access to birth control would free women from social, economic, and health risks that were associated with numerous pregnancies. It is also important to note the connections between eugenics found in Sanger's position on birth control. She believed that birth control would raise the quality of the white race by reducing the chances that immigrant women and African American women would give birth to unfit children. Many moral reformers traced the social problems to immigrants, and some embraced a nativist ideology, as well as efforts to promote immigration laws which would bar Catholics, Jews, and all non-Europeans from coming into the United States. Anti-immigration reformers supported the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. In 1908, Theodore Roosevelt limited the Japanese immigration to the United States. In 1913, California became the first of 13 states to bar Japanese immigrants from purchasing land. Immigration restrictions gained further traction in 1917 when Congress passed legislation banning the entry of illiterate people, alcoholics, people with diminished mental capacity, polygamists, anarchists, and epileptics, who reformers believed would either become a burden to the United States or disrupt the social order in the United States. Though political machines did work to solve some of the problems of immigration and industrialization, they did so by using graft and corruption. Reformers believed that changes in municipal government were essential. In 1900, after a hurricane hit and destroyed Galveston, Texas, the city leaders established a commission to take on the responsibility of rebuilding. And with that move, they initiated a new form of municipal government that the reformers embraced. The commission in Galveston was made up of 5 elected commissioners who each ran one branch of the city government as though it were a business. By 1917, the commission style of city government existed in more than 400 cities. In addition, to the commission form of government, reformers advocated for direct primaries that would allow voters to choose candidates, which was a step that took significant power away from the urban bosses, from those wealthy bosses. Do remember that not all people in a city can vote. Cities also implemented at-large elections in which that were citywide rather than district-based. And this took away a lot of power from immigrants who were crowded into small city districts. It also decreased the number of representatives in their areas. While this style of progressivism intended to inject some honesty into urban politics, the role in disempowering neighborhoods that were composed of ethnic minorities and racial minorities was impacted. The role of mayors also expanded under progressivism. A number of mayors implemented significant reforms. Tom Johnson of Cleveland worked to revise municipal tax codes, regulate the utilities, and make transit more affordable. Samuel Golden Rule Jones from Toledo implemented the 8-hour workday for all city employees and banned child labor. Hazen Pingree of Detroit implemented the city's school and recreational facilities and worked to make significant improvements. At the state level, men like Robert M. La Follette from Wisconsin, who was the governor from 1901 to 1906, implemented statewide direct primaries, improved civil service, weakened corporate influence, and instituted a graduated income tax. Remember, that was a populist idea. He also worked to strengthen state regulations on railroads. In 1913, the 17th Amendment granted voters the ability to directly elect their senators, a measure that significantly reduced corruption. So progressives do work very hard to address the issues of corruption in the United States. Now, Gifford Pinchot was the chief forester of the Department of Agriculture, and he endorsed using natural resources efficiently. He also hoped to make the government interests mesh with the interests of private companies, arguing that conservation had benefits for both groups. In 1906, an earthquake disrupted the flow of power and water to San Francisco. Pinchot supported a measure that would create a hydroelectric dam called Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park. But John Muir, who was an important naturalist, opposed this measure, arguing that the dam would destroy the park. Though Pinchot and Hetchy Dam won out after 7 years of debate, the battle helped to inspire an environmentalist movement. The planners of the Hetch Hetchy Dam project did not consult with the Native Americans who were living in the Yosemite Park area, indicating that progressive conservationists shared the same racial biases as other progressives who focused on urban and political issues. A former Assistant Secretary of the Navy and leader of the Rough Riders in the War of 1898, Theodore Roosevelt was elected Vice President in 1900 and became President after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. Now, Roosevelt believed that the presidency could be a bully pulpit from which he could promote and generate support for his programs, and the press and public embraced his energetic and outgoing personality. Roosevelt was a moderate who opposed radicalism. He believed that the president should be able to judge what was best for the public and that government-led reform was the most effective way to avoid revolution. Offering the public a square deal, Roosevelt argued that order and the equal administration of law would create a stable society. In 1902, he put these ideas into practice in the face of a coal strike in Pennsylvania. Roosevelt attempted to mediate the strike, hoping to prevent the supply of heating fuel from being cut off for the winter. In the face of a stalemate, Roosevelt threatened to send federal troops into the mines. At the conclusion of the strike, Roosevelt created a commission that gave the strikers a 10% raise and shorter hours, but that commission refused to recognize the union. Roosevelt earned the reputation as a trust buster. In 1902, he urged the Justice Department to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to sue the Northern Securities Company, which held a monopoly over the Northern railways. In 1904, the Supreme Court determined that Northern Securities was a barrier to free competition. This action was the first of 25 suits initiated by Roosevelt under the Antitrust Act. Roosevelt did not oppose all trusts whose practices were detrimental to consumers. He pushed Congress to pass the Elkins Act, which outlawed railroad rebates. It gave the Interstate Commerce Commission much more authority to regulate the railroads, and established the Department of Commerce and Labor, which regulated business practices. Roosevelt was reelected in 1904 and continued to bust trusts and increase government regulation of business, securing the passage of the Hepburn Act in 1906, which created a federally enforced standard for railroad rates. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, in which he described the dangerous and unsanitary working conditions in the meatpacking district of Chicago. This muckraking novel disgusted the readers and inspired Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act, which regulated food production and gave a boost to large corporations who could afford to meet the new standards. Now, the jungle also inspired consumer groups, doctors, scientists, and others to lobby for the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which banned the sale of any improperly labeled food and drugs. Now, at this particular time, there wasn't a lot of oversight in many industries, but in particular, the industries that packaged meat. Now, remember from chapter 15, we have a booming meat packing industry in the United States that is really thriving on cattle ranchers in the West. We also have a lot of people coming into the United States that need to be fed and need jobs. And there aren't any standards of health and hygiene. So you might have an employee who shows up to work and hasn't showered in a few days, and maybe they're sick and they're coughing over the food that they are preparing and packaging to be sold. There were also problems of mice and mice droppings in these meat plants as well. Occasionally, mice or other bugs might end up in the meat that would be shipped and sold in the United States. African Americans embraced the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, who invited Booker T. Washington to dine at the White House. Booker T. Washington was the first African American to do so. Although Roosevelt claimed to be undeterred by his white supremacist critics, Washington was also the last black guest to dine at the White House during Roosevelt's administration. Roosevelt did support the appointment of African Americans to federal jobs. When segregationist whites tried to remove Minnie Cox from her position as postmistress of Indianola, Mississippi, Roosevelt held firm and closed the post office rather than accept Minnie Cox's resignation. Roosevelt embraced eugenics and worried that native-born whites were committing race suicide by not having large enough families compared to immigrants and African Americans. After his reelection in 1904, Roosevelt became more willing to bow to the pressures posed by white supremacists. In 1906, white residents of Brownsville, Texas claimed that black soldiers from Fort Brown murdered a man. When no blacks claimed responsibility, Roosevelt gave 160 men dishonorable discharges from the military, even though there was no evidence that linked them to the murder. Roosevelt did not run for another term in 1908, leading to the election of William Howard Taft, a former federal judge and Solicitor General of the United States, Governor of the Philippines, and Secretary of War, who defeated William Jennings Bryan in Bryan's third attempt to win the presidency. Taft did not have the same public persona as Roosevelt and believed that the presidency had a much more narrow reach than Roosevelt did. Taft bowed to pressures and often embraced measures that were not progressive, including the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which many progressives disliked. Taft did engage in some conservation efforts, but he did fire Pinchot after criticizing the Secretary of the Interior, Richard Ballinger. This permanently tarnished Taft's reputation among conservationists. In spite of his initial support, Theodore Roosevelt eventually turned against Taft, whose presidency split the Republican Party in half. Roosevelt also disapproved of Taft's avid trust-busting, believing that filling numerous suits under the Sherman Antitrust Act was ineffective. Dismayed by Taft, Roosevelt felt that he was the man to solve the nation's problems and decided to run for president against Taft in 1912. Not as a Republican this time, but as a leader of his newly formed Progressive Party. In his campaign, Roosevelt argued for new nationalism, which was a concept that stated that government should fight for progressive measures in social justice by implementing income and inheritance taxes, an 8-hour workday, as well as an end to child labor, This Progressive Party also advocated for resources for workers and unions and women's suffrage. Heading the Democrat ticket in this particular election was a man named Woodrow Wilson, who was the governor of New Jersey. Wilson also embodied significant components of progressivism in his politics and embraced moralism as a fundamental political characteristic. Wilson's rallying cry was New Freedom, which held that the federal government should do little in the era of social reform and should confine its role to commerce, ensuring that free competition among business was largely unrestricted. There was a fourth candidate in the 1912 election, a man you may recall from Chapter 18, Eugene Debs of the Socialist Party. Debs hoped to dismantle capitalism and implement a government-owned ownership of business and industry in the United States. Because the Republican vote was split between Taft and Roosevelt, Wilson skated to an easy victory. Debs did win a respectable 1 million votes, and the election itself proved to be a referendum in favor of reform politics. It seemed at this particular time Americans were seeking reforms and wanted leadership from their government for those reforms. Wilson believed in a strong president who wielded significant authority in the government, and with a Democratic majority in Congress, he expected an easy road for his new freedom policies. Among the laws passed early in Wilson's administration was the 1913 Underwood Act. The 1913 Underwood Act reduced import duties and implemented populist reforms such as a graduated income tax, which was made possible by the ratification of the 16th Amendment. Remember, populism is this idea of being very concerned about the average person. Populists had advocated for that gradual income tax and the 8-hour workday and some restrictions on child labor way back in the late 1800s. Now, Wilson, who is a Democrat, is advocating for these policies. The 1913 Underwood Act, again, implements the graduated income tax, as well as reducing imports on duties. The 16th Amendment is the amendment that implements income taxes based on one's income. The graduated income tax initially only affected about 10% of the population because people who earned less than $4,000 in a year were exempt. For those who made more than $4,000 a year, the tax ranged from 1% to 6%. Bank reform was another key component of Wilson's agenda, and he pushed for the creation of the Federal Reserve System, in which 12 regional banks would lend cash to their member banks at a rate that accounted for the demand for credit. The measure also made the currency uniform and was particularly beneficial to farmers who routinely operated under debt. Wilson also pushed for the establishment of the Federal Trade Commission in 1914, which replaced the Bureau of Corporations and sought to prohibit unfair business practices. The same year, Wilson signed the Clayton Antitrust Law, which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. Most of Wilson's new freedom measures passed very quickly, but the Republican Party regrouped in 1914 and won back some of its congressional seats, shifting the balance of power and pushing Wilson to advocate for further progressive reform. In 1914 congressional elections, Wilson embraced some of the elements of Roosevelt's new nationalism, promoting measures like the Adamson Act of 1916, which put into place the 8-hour workday for the railroad workers. The Keating-Owen Act, which outlawed child labor in the conduct of any kind of interstate commerce, and the Workmen's Compensation Act, which extended insurance to federal employees. Wilson, who also won a second term in 1916, did little to win the support of African Americans. He embraced his Southern roots and Southern values, and many of his appointees were Southerners as well. White supremacy infused the culture of Washington, D.C., as Wilson segregated government offices and facilities. Wilson, who argued that segregation was good for African Americans, also did damage to his reputation among blacks by holding a White House screening of the film Birth of a Nation, which glorified the rise of the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction. The federal government had grown significantly more than Wilson anticipated by the time his second term began, with regulatory measures and progressive forms as the central features of his presidency. Here we see a piece of propaganda from this particular time period. It's an abstinence poster, and it says, if some wise guy tells you that sexual intercourse is not dangerous, don't believe him. And then it goes on to say, a girl who would yield one man has probably had relations with another, and she is very likely diseased. This abstinence poster really places the blame for STDs on women alone. In this 1914 image from a newspaper, it is called Sanitary Precautions, and it really kind of indicates issues in terms of public health and that connection being specific to African Americans. Now, African Americans in the South were segregated, but because their health issues were not created because they were segregated. Their health issues that African Americans experienced during this particular time were directly related to the fact that the only housing that they had was very dilapidated. Their food sources were minimal, so their diets were not great. And they also didn't have access to the same water, the same food, the same clothing as their white counterparts. That brings us to the end of chapter 19.